Thank you for coming today. My name is Jett. I'm a correspondent board governor here at the FCC. And we have with us here today Michael Bociurkiw, who is going to talk to us about the conflict in Ukraine, including the media coverage of it and its impact on journalists, some of whom have been killed covering this conflict, as you saw in this video, which didn't actually include everybody.
Right.
Yeah. So I'll just start by telling you a bit about Michael. Michael Bociurkiw is a global affairs analyst and non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, who has been based in Ukraine since before the Russian invasion in February 2022. He is a frequent guest on the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, and other global media outlets. He's a former journalist who was a staff reporter for Asia Times in Thailand and Malaysia, the South China Morning Post here in Hong Kong, and the Winnipeg Free Press. He also previously served as spokesperson for UNICEF in Geneva and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So Michael, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
We'll do a bit of a Q&A, and then we'll open it up to the audience, so be thinking about your questions. And be sure to please silence your phones as well. So I'll just start by asking, how did you end up in Ukraine? When were you first there, and what are you doing there?
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to the beautiful staff here at the FCC, to Hugo and David, and also to my former colleague and longtime friend, Chris Dobson, for pushing me to come here and do this. It really, really feels to me like I'm coming home, not only to the club, but to Hong Kong, a city I really love, and worked here, as Jennifer said, for the South China Morning Post, and we were part of the opening team of Eastern Express, so I had to make that hop across the harbor to Kowloon Bay, which is a real shocker after being in Quarry Bay. But it was, at that time, and just a reminder that at that time the South China Morning Post was owned by News Corp, Rupert Murdoch. We were working with a lot of interesting editors and reporters at the time. But in a way, this talk is completing a full circle for me because incredibly, it was, and I'm of Ukrainian origin, it was in 1990 that the SCMP agreed to send me to Ukraine. It was right around the time when Glasnost was happening. These grassroots opposition parties were taking root in Ukraine, and a real feeling of excitement that finally Ukraine could be taking the step towards independence. And just to briefly put that into context for you in terms of what that meant for Russia, Ukraine leaving, it was Lenin who once said, for us to lose Ukraine would be like us losing our head. And we kind of see that playing out today with Russia's full-scale invasion and their inability, psychologically, mentally, and otherwise, to let Ukraine be an independent country. So anyway, going back to that trip briefly, I covered that movement, and I also went to Chernobyl and did a big feature on the nuclear power plant, 1986. Big explosion there that sent radioactive clouds all over, and it was due to a so-called mistake or accident or experiment from the Russian side. And I mention this because now that I'm back in Ukraine, and I'll describe briefly how I ended up there again, is that, again, we feel like it's history repeating itself. When I was a kid growing up in a very heavily patriotic kind of Ukrainian-Canadian environment, we did not have a normal childhood. Unlike our compatriot here, David, I never learned how to play hockey. I was too busy being Ukrainian. And what that meant at the time was not going to summer camps and things like that. It meant protesting in front of the Russian embassy, saying KGB set them free, or free Ukrainian prisoners of conscience. And that continued through my student years for a long, long time. So that's very, very heavily ingrained in me. And when I'm commenting on the conflict right now, I think back to a lot of the lessons our parents used to teach us, our Ukrainian school teachers used to teach us of the persecution of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the liquidation of Ukrainian museums and cultural institutions, the deportation, mass deportation of Ukrainians to the tundra in Siberia. Again, a lot what we're seeing now. Now, to the current situation, by the time the full-scale invasion happened, I was an independent commentator and writer, writing mostly at the time for CNN Opinion. And it was Putin's rambling 5,000-word essay in the fall of 2023 that to me, 2021, that to me seemed the kind of starting pistol of his ambition to invade Ukraine. It was in that essay that he basically said Ukrainians and Russians are the same, that they're unable to run their own country. There are a lot of Russian speakers there that need protection. Oh, and by the way, Ukraine is full of Nazis too, so we need to take care of this problem. And then you'll recall that in the weeks leading up to February 2022, there was a big buildup of Russian forces along the borders of Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine border and Russia-Belarus. And so I ended up there in January. And then, of course, in February of that year, the full-scale invasion. And this is a bit controversial to say this, but I promised Jennifer that I wouldn't hold back that much this time. But it seemed like one of the only people that did not admit that there's a full-scale invasion about to happen was President Zelensky. In fairness, I think that him and his team wanted to not cause panic and have people flee Ukraine. But that's indeed what happened when Russia invaded. You had roads clogged and things like that. People are really struggling to get out quickly. So, and it was also in those first few days where Ukraine struck back very, very hard to put Russia on the back foot. And kind of end this, I think had the West ponied up, grew the backbone to supply Ukraine with everything it asked for, air defense systems, ammunition, long-range rockets, we wouldn't be where we are today. Probably there would be no war. So it's a pity things played out the way they did, but I think most of us will agree that Ukrainians with very little resources and with this drip, drip, drip approach to supplying Ukraine to what it needs militarily have done an amazing job. One quick factoid, I mean, a big part of the Russian Black Sea fleet is on the floor of the Black Sea, and Ukraine hardly had any navy. A lot of the Russian munitions storage capabilities have had to be sent further into mainland Russia because Ukraine is striking harder with drones. I think it's about 13% of Russian refining capability destroyed due to Ukrainian drones. So it's quite an amazing, considering what they started with and where we are now.
So as you say, the support for Ukraine from the US and other countries has been quite drawn out, the drip, drip, drip. So you've been in Ukraine all this time. You were just at the UN General Assembly in New York, where President Zelensky addressed the General Assembly. Where does the conflict stand now? What does President Zelensky want, and how are the US and other supporters of Ukraine feeling about all this?
Yeah, so I forgot to add that when the war started, I was based in Kyiv, and then I relocated to Lviv in western Ukraine, where, by the way, CNN established a huge presence, and I basically was living out of their bureau doing a lot of commentary. And now I find myself in Odessa on the Black Sea, because it's a very unique kind of perch to watch this war playing out. And I remind you that Odessa is a world port. It basically feeds the world. But yet, that is a big attraction for Russian forces. They've been striking Odessa port relentlessly, and they've also been striking smaller ports along the Danube River. And this has caused massive disruption to the global food supply chain in terms of price hikes, in terms of some countries in Africa not getting Ukrainian grain, not getting Ukrainian sunflower seed oil. And I think it was President Zelensky who said, why is it that a small group of men in the Kremlin can get to decide what people get to eat at night around the world or what they pay at the checkout counter? So going to where we are now, you're right, I just came back from the UNGA and from watching up close the US election play out as well. And of course, President Zelensky was there with his team, but he was without one very, very important person, in my opinion, and that is the then Foreign Affairs Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, who is admired worldwide in capitals around the world for his just intellect, his experience, his ability to listen and to negotiate. So things went sadly pretty sideways quickly for the Ukrainian team. President Zelensky came to New York, first of all, with a so-called victory plan, which he said he's going to introduce only to President Biden, the Vice President, and to Mr. Trump and his VP pick. As of today, we don't have an exact idea of what exactly is in there, but it does look very much like a repackaging of his previous peace plan, and that is basically no giving up of sovereign territory that was taken by Russia. That includes Crimea, that includes the Donbass region. It definitely includes things like Ukraine's path into NATO, into the EU, exchange of POWs, that sort of thing. Curiously, and I mentioned this on BBC, Zelensky also came to New York saying we have new Ukrainian intelligence showing that Russia is poised to strike the 4 nuclear power plants in Ukraine, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which Russia occupies at the moment, but which is the biggest in Europe. And this struck us as kind of odd. He said that this is based on satellite intelligence. Well, the fact of the matter is that all of these plants, and I double-checked this before coming here, were built during Soviet times. They know where they are. They have the blueprints. So if they really wanted to do something, they could quite easily. The other thing that happened, might be getting too much in the weeds here in terms of US politics, but Zelensky made that very widely publicized trip to the munitions factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the only people mostly around them were Democrats, so Republicans had a field day with this, saying the Ukrainians are getting too much involved in US politics, playing favoritism with the Democrats. And then finally, the biggest point on Zelensky's to-do list was to get President Biden finally to approve Ukraine's use of Western missiles for long-range use to strike deeper inside Russia at the very airfields where Russia is sending missiles into Ukraine, including to my adopted city of Odessa. That has not come. Now, these are, to be clear, these are Storm Shuttle missiles produced by the United Kingdom and France, but it uses US tracking satellite technology. So the US has to give approval for this to happen. They have not, and I just came out of an Atlantic Council strategy session in New York, which is supposed to be off the record, but they know I have a bit of a big mouth. And it was generally agreed there, but this is an Atlantic Council talking point, that the White House and the State Department are still very, very scared of Putin's nuclear saber rattling. They believe that indeed he could use tactical nuclear weapons if pushed into the corner. I don't think so. I don't think China, which has a lot of influence, probably more than anyone else over Putin, will allow it. But yet they have this fear, and that's why they're resisting. So finally, I think what's going to happen, as has happened a lot in this war, is that things will quietly happen anyway, and the US will fall into line behind European partners and improve the use of those long-range weapons, which Zelensky believes will be a game changer in the war, but which Secretary Austin says it's just not enough. It's not enough to push the Russians back completely.
So how is all of this going to end? Is there a path to peace, and what does that look like? You mentioned China,
Yeah.
which I believe has the only peace plan on the table, although it's certainly not a peace plan that Ukraine or the US likes.
Right.
Where is this going?
Well, there are various peace plans on the table. One is by China, which it has some interesting elements in it, but it has also what you would predict. It talks about Western sanctions, that they shouldn't be used to any degree to the way they are now. But it does state, and you can understand this if it's coming from China or from India, about territorial integrity and how important that is. I think China will remain a very, very big player in the so-called path to peace. You also have the Saudis, which are playing a much bigger role in international diplomacy than they once did. It will likely be that after the US election that Saudi Arabia will host the second peace summit, but they will only do it on condition that Russia is at the table. And if that's the case, China will show up, and hopefully there'll be some sensible heads there, and they'll push the Russians into agreeing what meet somewhere in between with Ukraine. Give up seized territory, exchange of POWs, and also a very, very big one is reparations. Costs of damage goes into the tens or hundreds of billions right now. The big problem right now is that the Russians, in their proposals, are showing no desire to give up territory, and that's the main thing for Ukraine. If you were to ask me whether many Ukrainians, given that they're so weary after 2.5 years of war, would be willing to accept some kind of sacrifices there on the territory side, I would say that there's probably a growing amount of people who do, because otherwise they don't see an end to this war, to the bloodshed, to the daily missile attacks, to the drone attacks. I should have mentioned a bit earlier, I'm sorry, is that we're also lurking in the background is part of the so-called axis of evil, Iran. They've been supplying Russia with very, very huge amount of sophisticated drones, which attack Ukrainian cities and villages, and crucially, critical infrastructure on a daily basis. And if the Americans are to be believed, they're also about to supply Ukraine with medium-range missiles, which will join the missiles coming from North Korea as well. So there's a lot of different balls in the air right now. And the other thing, of course, we have to mention, which will happen, as I said, before the peace summit, are the US elections. Zelensky did have, let's call it a cordial meeting with the guy with the tan from Florida for, I think it was an hour. And Trump, as he does very well, uttered the right things. You know, we'll have a look at what's going on. Ukrainians have been, too many of them have been dying. But then, as often happens with the Trump team, they contradict themselves, and they're still intent on their plan, which is to, number one, make a deal very quickly. Trump claims he'll make a deal even before, if he's elected, before he's inaugurated. But it will not be anything near what Ukraine wants. But through J.D. Vance, they said that they will be okay with the Russians holding on to the territory they've seized, maybe even having control not only of the Donetsk region, but also a couple of other oblasts. They're talking about what's called a demilitarized zone with peacekeepers, which I'm sure they'd populate so they can manipulate them. And also, which Ukraine will never agree to, is they want Ukraine to drop any plans to join NATO and other Western allied organizations. So that's where we are right now. In the broader context, if the way things remain the way they are right now, I could see this war keeping on until Putin dies, whenever that happens, and there's a change of government.
You mentioned Donald Trump.
Yeah.
What happens if Kamala Harris wins the election? What would that mean for Ukraine?
I think it will be the same for whatever theater of conflict we're looking at, including the current one in the Middle East, which we should all be very, very concerned about, as a continuation of, for example, in that case, backing Israel quite heavily. But I think what's going to happen in a slow way, if she gets in, is that more of the responsibility for settling this war or supporting the Ukrainians will fall on the shoulders of the European capitals, especially the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, even Giorgia Meloni, who has a very tricky coalition in her backyard, has come out very strongly for Ukraine. But I think it will probably happen under Biden too, because let's not forget, he has his legacy to protect. So I think with a lot of things recently we've seen happening in Ukraine, Ukrainians have been going ahead anyway. For example, the incursion in Kursk. And with the motto, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. So I think that's going to happen with the long-range missiles, getting permission for that. To their credit, the Biden administration, with a heavy backing of VP Harris and European allies, have been future-proofing or Trump-proofing Ukraine, thinking that if he does get in their words, God forbid, funding will be cut off for Ukraine. So Biden just announced another aid package in the billions of dollars range, more weapons. But again, I have to remind you that Ukraine is not the size of Israel. It's not the size of New Jersey. It's the size of France. It cannot be protected like the Iron Dome system protects Israel. It's just too big of a territory. Cities like Kyiv are pretty well protected, especially the government quarter. Odessa now not too badly, but it's not enough. They need those long-range missile strike capabilities to strike Russian munitions dumps further into Russia and the launch pads from where those jets take off and fire missiles at Ukraine.
I wanted to talk a bit about media coverage
Sure.
of the war in Ukraine. And I think there might have been a couple of people you wanted to mention specifically.
Yeah.
But how has Ukrainian media covered the war? How have they been affected by it?
Yeah. Well, to put it bluntly, it's a disaster right now, the Ukrainian media landscape, because even before the war, what was happening in Ukraine, the big 4 or 5 TV channels were controlled by oligarchs. And the biggest channel was controlled by someone whose name you might recognize, Igor Kolomoisky, who was the backer of President Zelensky in the day, a channel called 1+1. So a lot of them loved owning these channels. They had a great deal. They invested very little in terms of resources, in terms of training, and yet they were able to manipulate these channels for their own self-interest. That has now kind of crumbled away. And what we have right now, in the first days of the war, President Zelensky, I guess the best word to use is mandated what's called a 24/7 telemarathon, where all of these channels that I just talked about have been crammed into a 24-hour kind of schedule, no advertising, and it's all very kind of pro-Ukrainian patriotic type of broadcasting, no enterprise reporting, no investigative reporting. And quite frankly, the ratings have gone down, very far down as you might expect, and no one's making any money. And then alongside that, you saw the video, the killing of journalists, either in one case just RFE, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty journalist sitting in her flat in Kyiv, and a Russian missile struck it, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time on the front line, or you have journalists who have volunteered to go to the front line, or who have been conscripted to go there. But the biggest number of losses have been Ukrainian journalists who have fled for safer ground, mostly to Europe. They're now Ukrainian media in exile. On top of that, many newsrooms have been destroyed. There is, as I said, there's no digital advertising market left, no money coming in. And because so many people have left, and this isn't only the media sector, wherever you go in Ukraine now, you see help wanted everywhere. Natalia Sedlacka, who runs an award-winning investigative program on TV in Ukraine, told me, I can't hire investigative journalists anymore. They've all gone. So I'm part of the Ukrainian Journalist Association of North America. We had a big conference in New York in May. And we basically, alongside Ukrainian journalists, came up with a bit of a manifesto saying that of all the tens of billions that are going to go into Ukraine in the rebuilding of Ukraine, not 1 cent should go in until investment is put into the Ukrainian media sector, because we all know about the allegations of corruption in Ukraine. It is quite widespread, even during war, sad to say. And I think many of us will agree that media is the best check against that. And also, I don't know if there are any businessmen here, but in order to go freshly invest in a country where you've never been, you rely on credible information, and that's what the media provides. So we're looking to marshal at least about $20 million for that. It's basically a drop in the ocean, considering what's happened. And then finally, we have to start thinking about, because as I said, the war has no end in sight, about funding Ukrainian media in exile, creating offshore newsrooms where they can report on events going on back home in the language, in Russian and Ukrainian, but also to work alongside other groups of media in exile from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Belarus, from Russia, many of which are in North America and Europe. We just had this discussion at the Atlantic Council event in New York, and I think perhaps if you asked me to give you a takeaway, this is something that the club might take an interest in as well, or any journalist societies that are represented here, to see how we can harness the skills of this sadly very big growing number of journalists who have been forced into exile, so that we can leverage that brain trust, that experience. And they could, I think, also report from a different perspective on different events going on around the world. So that's where we are with the media landscape in Ukraine, but it isn't getting any better. The deaths or the injuries are really going up. Yeah, so that's where we are.
And lastly, I wanted to ask what you think about the international media coverage of Ukraine,
Sure.
and where would you suggest people go to get news about what's happening here?
Okay. Sorry, one more important fact is related to media coverage as well of Ukrainian media is the power outages. Because if you're a journalist and you have no power, but you also don't have telecommunications, because when the power outages happen, within about 5-10 minutes, the cell phone signal starts to go out, and then internet and mobile data. So it's very, very difficult to get your work done. And projections are that come winter, there will be power outages, including of heat, of up to 18 hours a day. So in the worst case scenario, that could trigger another outflow of Ukrainians, including people who work in the media sector, about 5 to 6 million people. It's going to be huge. In terms of the media coverage, what we saw, I think we can credit Mr. Putin in an odd way for a lot of Western media organizations moving their operations from Moscow to Kiev because it's become so unsafe for Western media to work in Russia. So now we have new bureaus that didn't exist anymore. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN has a semi-permanent presence there that it never did, and quite a few others. And then on top of that, we have waves and waves of visiting journalists. Christiane Amanpour comes a lot, for example. So that really adds to the coverage. And then you have the foreign language services. For example, the Ukrainian service of the BBC is very active, reporting on what's going on a very kind of granular basis. So BBC has done a stellar job. Go from time to time to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. They have a rolling live page there on the coverage of Ukraine. And then in terms of, the kind of output that Western organizations have been putting out, I think it's actually been very good. And I have to also put a shout out to Al Jazeera. They've been there on a consistent basis. They send big teams that actually stay for a long time and do quite long documentaries, investigations into what's happening in Ukraine. A problem, though, and I think you and I discussed this the other day when we were prepping, is that the Ukrainian government decided at the start of the war to keep really tight tabs on the media, not only local media, but foreign media. And that includes, for example, reporting live on Russian missile strikes. It's forbidden to film live a Russian missile strike, for example, in Lviv, Ukraine, because the thinking in Kiev is that this will give too accurate targeting information back to the Russians. And they are now in the habit of doing double strikes. The other thing is we have seen quite a few embeds happen recently of Western journalists with Ukrainian forces, but it's very, very difficult to cover there spontaneously. Permissions take a long time. I hear stories of military accreditation taking a longer time. And final point, I know Zelensky and his team won't like to hear this, but they love to control the image of themselves. And as I won't name him, one foreign journalist who wrote quite a critical piece about Zelensky earlier on in the war, he's not been banned by the country, but I don't think they pick up his phone calls anymore. And I think they have to stop doing this. There's now, again, I may be going a little bit too into the weeds here, but I think it's important to say this. there's been a real centralization of power within the presidential administration, and I think that's why we saw the pushing out of Foreign Affairs Minister Kuleba. But it goes right down to the attitude: if you're not with us, you're out. So I'm not saying there's an element of self-censorship going on, but you're certainly creating the conditions for that to happen, because if you're in Ukraine as a foreign journalist, you don't have that military press card. Very, very difficult for you to do your work.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. We've got microphones going around. We'll start with Chris.
Mike, you mentioned the foreign minister.
Oh, sorry, there's a microphone there.
You mentioned the foreign minister there. Why was he fired, and why did it happen before the trip to the US?
So when you're based in a country, wherever it is, you notice subtleties that other people may not. And you've seen Zelensky and his team enough that they show up in the White House or whatever at the UN General Assembly in their green fatigues. It's become kind of the Zelensky team uniform. And what I noticed over the past few weeks, including when Minister Kuleba went to China, he started putting on his dapper suits again. And I thought, I smell something coming. It was kind of a drift. It signaled a drift away from the Zelensky team. What I'm told is that Kuleba was actually on the brink of getting the Americans to agree on that green light to send Western-supplied missiles deeper into Russia. I think he was becoming too visible. I think he might have had some disagreements, which again are not tolerated very well in the Zelensky administration. And that might have even been whether Ukraine should invade Kursk or do an incursion into Kursk, because it may draw too many forces away, and how is it going to be accepted in the West. So I think it was a buildup of things like that. But it was a very humiliating exit for him. He did not even appear, as one does when you leave the government, to the Committee on Foreign Affairs to report on what he's been doing. And, this is another example of the administration doing something that's very self-inflicted. I did a check and I noticed that the Foreign Affairs Minister of Germany and of other countries, they tweeted their, congratulations or whatever you want to call it, their good luck to Kuleba, but they didn't congratulate or wish goodwill to the new guy coming in. They replaced Kuleba with a very junior guy. And I think this is also the Zelensky administration going even further into this centralization of power and saying, we're going to be ones to handle foreign affairs. We're going to be the ones to handle all of the communications. I'm not the first one to say this, but at the beginning of the war, the feet of the foreign ministry was kind of under it. And the presidential administration took control over a lot of communications. But what we saw happen just a few days ago in Washington was a fiasco. And I think had Kuleba been one of the voices of the table, that would have never have happened. I'll admit, Kuleba is a friend of mine. I did a long interview with him for my podcast. And there were three things that he had on his to-do list when he was appointed. One was to have parity in terms of the number of female and male Ukrainian ambassadors. In his first year and a half, the number of female Ukrainian ambassadors went up from 4 to 14. He wanted to professionalize the foreign ministry more, and he wanted to show the world, in his words, what fighters Ukrainians are. Sadly, he won't be able to complete that legacy.
Yes, Elaine?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to have you share with us. We don't get that many people through who have on-the-ground experience, so we appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, this will be obviously a generalization, but do you get a sense what the Ukrainian people would be willing to accept as circumstances going forward? We've been a long time into this now. Must be exhausting, terrifying, everything else. Where are the people are generally?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways to answer that. Thank you for the great question. Is that, number one, we have to talk about what the Ukrainians, the dwindling number of Ukrainians remaining in Ukraine feel, and what the Ukrainians, the millions of Ukrainians overseas feel. I talked to both groups quite extensively. And, sadly, the longer this drags on, the less chance there is for a lot of the Ukrainians who have fled to come back, it's an enormous blow for the country. I can't even find the words for it. And also a little subtlety here is that men between the ages, I believe it's 18 and 60, are banned from leaving the country. Hence, a lot of the people who have left are women and children, and many of them with very little means. But talking to that group, they tell me, of course, that we want to come back to Ukraine in peace, where we're not woken up in the middle of the night by air raid sirens or the sounds of rockets and drones. But we also want to come back to Ukraine that is more or less corruption-free. So the Zelensky government shouldn't feel that they have a pass, that they can suspend their fight against corruption just because there's a war. If you talk to some people in Ukraine, as I do, they will say that corruption is thriving in the midst of war. One reason for that is that the penalties are very low. There was a case of someone in Western Ukraine diverting 20 million or so in resources that were supposed to go to the soldiers. 12 years is the maximum penalty for something like that. Even before the war started, Zelensky was on the hot seat, on the hot plate, for very slowly doing judicial reform, which is a big thing they need to do to get themselves into the EU. As for the Ukrainians left, I mean, look, I talked to some of them during my recent trip to Kiev, and one of, was a male taxi driver, and believe me, I don't just talk to taxi drivers, but he said, and this has been repeated in a number of different places too, is why should I go fight for this country when you see what's going on in front of you, all of this wealth swooshing around in Kiev, unexplained wealth, and there is a lot of it. So that is why corruption is so important for them to get rid of. As I said at the beginning, is that the last thing any Ukrainian wants is to have to give up Ukrainian sovereign territory. But look, I was serving with the OSCE in Ukraine in 2014, 2015, when the so-called little green men came into first Crimea, and then they went into eastern Ukraine. And by the way, it was a very, very bizarre situation. I'll just give you a quick example. We were in the city hall in Donetsk city. Half of it was occupied by these so-called little green men, these Russian-backed thugs, and the other half by Ukrainian officials. But it was this kind of creeping invasion that happened that almost nobody noticed. But now, of course, the front line is well over 1,000 kilometers long now, and the Russians do control quite a huge percentage of what's called the Donbass region. And in fact, they just seized in the past 24 hours another strategic town. They're poised to take over another one called Kursk, and then that will put them very close to a very, very strategic city called Kramatorsk. So they are seeming to gain ground, and I don't see a mechanism in front of us right now for this fighting to stop, for the Russians to come to the negotiating table and say, okay, we're going to give up this territory, we're going to give it back to you. I think there is some what we call confidence building measures. Recently there was an exchange of POWs. That will continue. The other thing that has to happen, which I don't think the Russians will do easily, is to return the thousands and thousands of Ukrainian children that have been forcibly deported to Russia, forcibly put up for adoption. Millions of Ukrainians are said to have been forcibly deported through filtration centers. So there's that issue as well. And then there's the issue of reparations. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in damage right now, including 2 iconic pieces of Ukrainian identity: churches, museums, you name it. That's aside from the maternity hospitals, kids' hospitals that have been bombed. The Russians know exactly what they're doing in terms of not only seizing territory, but trying to destroy and wipe out Ukrainian identity. Museums, for instance, something, I think the number is in the 300 at least, Ukrainian cultural institutions have been destroyed completely, partially destroyed, and in the process, the Russians have stolen a lot of priceless Ukrainian artifacts. It's now regarded as the biggest art heist in history since the Nazi plunder of Europe. So it's difficult to wrap your head around it, and I think that as the Russians consciously wear down the Ukrainians that have stayed in Ukraine, perhaps they will be more in a mood to say, okay, we want this to end, there's enough bloodshed. But it's for them to say that, it's for Zelensky to say that. And finally, I'll end that if that does happen, and God forbid it does, in my opinion, what kind of message is that giving to other bad guys? That you can go into anywhere you want, seize territory and hold on to it, and with not much of a whimper from the international community.
Yes, question here?
Thank you very much, Michael. You mentioned China. Could you say a bit more about China? Do you sense a shift of its stance from the beginning of the war to now? And also, what kind of lesson you think China can learn from this war when it comes to their own, plan of reunification? Thank you.
I'm kind of smiling because I realize I have to be very careful what I say, where I am right now. But look, as I said, I'm based in Odessa, and if I'm in what I call the green zone. I'm between the Chinese consulate and the Turkish consulate, so I feel relatively safe. And to give you an idea of the stake China has in Ukraine, they have the Chinese consulate in Odessa is actually bigger than the Canadian embassy in Kyiv. So it's an indication of how vested they are. And before the war started, Zelensky actually said there's no bigger, more important economic partner to Ukraine than China. Because China does get a lot of resources from Ukraine. There's a very, very green field for them to get more involved in. I think I'm pretty accurate in saying that even before the war, Chinese made mobile phones far outnumbered the Guaylo ones, Apple, whatever. So the Chinese car market is really picking up in Ukraine. So I think we all agree that when it comes to these types of issues, China looks at it very pragmatically as well. And I think they want to retain their relationship with Ukraine. I think the Russians have shown themselves to be quite an annoying junior partner. Not only did Putin lie to Xi Jinping when he was there for the Olympics, saying he wouldn't invade, but also I think it was about a year and a half ago, the Chinese voiced quite a bit of displeasure when their consulate in Odessa was sprayed quite badly by a Russian missile that landed in the same neighborhood. Now, having said all that, the Chinese, Mr. Xi and Mr. Putin, have quite a interesting, I would say almost robust relationship. The Chinese do get Russian military equipment, they get resources. But if we are to take them at their word and believe that they really believe in sovereignty and territorial integrity, they will find some way to end this war. As I told you the other day, I think if Mr. Xi called Mr. Putin today or tomorrow and said, stop the war, he will. I think China, very crucially, also plays a role in Mr. Putin not using tactical nuclear weapons. That's a red line for China, I believe. But China being China is also looking at this to leverage their campaign against, let me politely call it Western hegemony, domination of international affairs, also of sanctions. And I think China is also looking to upgrade its image of a peacekeeper or diplomat on the world stage like the Saudis are. Hence, you saw the appointment of a Chinese envoy making trips to various capitals, including Kyiv and Moscow, to try and broker a deal. So it's a very complicated relationship, but I think China wants to see this end. I would like to think again that they will find a way to end this where a lot of the crucial territory that was taken is given back to Ukraine. You know, and the other thing you have to think, because we're all familiar, I think, with the Belt and Road Initiative, things like that. China needs greenfield areas to deploy their millions of workers. And the destruction of Ukraine also presents opportunities, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's power plants. There are a lot of things, roads, bridges, you name it, that China could play a role in repairing and restoring. So I think for that reason too, they will want to keep fairly good relationships with Kiev and broker a deal, or help broker a deal that will be an amicable one.
We have just another minute or two, I think, time for one last question, if there are any. Yes.
First question is, are you a betting man? And if the answer to that is yes, how much money would you be prepared to put on Zelensky still being in power 6 months from now?
First of all, I'm not a gambler, but it's a great question. Well, I covered the Zelensky campaign mostly for CNN Opinion, and people forget this, but he promised to be a one-term president. And you know, look, I did voice some criticism of him, but there's absolutely nothing that can train you to be a wartime president. I don't care who you are. And he's done a fabulous job in that way in terms of mobilizing resources, speaking on the international stage. He came in with very, very low expectations. He came in with a lot of people saying there's no way he'll stand up to Putin, but actually he did. I mean, there were deals made with Putin, POW exchanges or whatever, that worked very, very well under Zelensky. But we have to admit that his ratings, popularity ratings, are very low, that there are concerns outside of Ukraine about his ability to really fight corruption. And again, this, I call it a fiasco, what happened in the United States, doesn't bode very well. So I think he'll try and stay for as long as he can. The problem is that I think if you look at the opposition parties, one of them is still run by the former president, Poroshenko. I don't think he's capable of tackling a lot of the issues that we have on the table right now, especially economic ones. So I don't know who could easily replace him. And you know, sadly, a lot of Western educated technocrats have left or have been forced out. So it's probably, all things considered, a good idea for him to stay for now. But I can tell he's getting very weary and tired too. Yeah, so it's hard to say on that one. But I think he should stick to his promise to be a one-term president. And under martial law, don't forget, elections aren't required. Try to find a way out of this. But again, to repeat myself, there's very, very little meeting of minds between Moscow and Kiev right now on how we're going to achieve peace or a lasting ceasefire. I didn't mention Turkey, but I'll just briefly mention that Turkey, who is ironically a NATO member, but also buys weapons from Russia, also is getting new nuclear reactors built by Russia. Mr. Erdogan is one of the few leaders who has a foot in both regions, who can pick up the phone and speed dial Mr. Putin and try and talk some sense to him. So I think if we are to talk about a path to peace, Turkey will play a very crucial role as kind of a guarantor to peace and also helping rebuild Ukraine. So I'm not sure if that's a very accurate answer, but it's hard to say. Oh, sorry, and one more thing. I'm also sensing that, talking about Mr. Zelensky, that he's in a tough spot because, you know, we've had martial law from pretty much day one. We've had our airspace completely closed since day one. No airports are functioning. It's very difficult for people to move around, to get in and out. And about a couple of years ago, the deputy mayor of Lviv suggested to me that they do regional lifting of martial law or ease martial law, curfews, things like that, so things can start to get back to normal and people can start feeling more comfortable to come back to Ukraine and live more normal lives.
Well, I think we have to end it there, unfortunately. But thank you so much, Michael, for being here today. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you. And if I can quickly mention my website, michaelbociurkiw.com, and there's a daily world briefing there and ways you can support as well. So please feel free to go there every day and check up on the news.
michaelbociurkiw.com.
Yeah.
And before you all go, just bear with me 1 minute. I wanted to let you know about a couple of upcoming events we have. Next Wednesday, we'll have Raymond Young, Chief Economist for Greater China at ANZ, talking about the future of fiat currency and geopolitics. Wednesday the 16th, we have a club lunch. It's a panel of speakers talking about neurodiversity and how businesses in Hong Kong can benefit from supporting and employing neurodivergent people. And then on the 21st, we have another club lunch featuring Hong Kong's very own 16-year-old winner of the Pokemon Go World Championship. So lots of variety. Please look out for those. And finally, thank you again for those of you who are members who came today, and a special thank you to the guests of members here today. You'll see at your seats, you should all have some information about FCC membership. We always welcome people to apply. You do not have to be a journalist to join the FCC. And if you have any questions about membership, feel free to talk to me, our general manager, David Breitling, or anyone on staff. So thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you.